Well, I'm glad to be able to give today's lecture. The title, as advertised in the brochure, I think there's some truth in advertising here. I think it says applications and extensions of Austrian macroeconomics. Well, the extension is going to take the form of showing how we can use the Austrian theory to understand the more mainstream monetarism that we get from Milton Friedman. And the application will consist of showing just how and why the Austrian theory turns out to be much more applicable to the interesting episodes of boom and bust than does the monetarist theory. It turns out that it's sort of strange. It's a puzzle, and I expect people to ask this as one of their questions. It's a question I always have: is how is it that even though the monetarist theory doesn't explain the 20s boom and subsequent bust, while the Austrian theory does, nonetheless monetarism seems to win out in academics over the Austrian theory? It's sort of a puzzle to figure out. I've also seen just in the last few days, there's a new book out by Mark Skousen, and it's called Vienna versus Chicago. In fact, on the little label of my diskette, that's the exact title I wrote for this show, although here I call it Monetarist versus Austrian views, same thing. Okay? And reading that book, I see it's very much reinforces some of the things I'll give you here today. Skousen has a discussion of favorite economists. Who are Friedman's favorite classical economists or old-time economists or whatever? And in an interview, he's actually given the choice between Mises and Keynes, which is the better of the two. And Friedman says Keynes. Okay, Friedman says Keynes was the better economist, and that dovetails with some of my own work, and I think will be understandable in terms of the show I'll present today. In fact, another tie-in here is I'm currently working on a contribution to a handbook published by Edward Elgar. It's called The Hayek Companion, and the chapter that was farmed out to me is Hayek and the Orthodox Chicago School, which I take to mean Milton Friedman. And there I had a chance to sort out some of these issues and to show how Friedman, in a lot of respects, especially methodological respects, is much more akin to Keynesian views than the Austrian views. So we'll take a look here. Notice I say the many faces of monetarism. I'll try to point out where I'm just switching ground and showing that the monetarists said A and they also said B, and those two things aren't really internally consistent. But we'll go on to try to reconcile to the extent possible that monetarist view and get out of it what we can. And I have to say I'm an admirer of Friedman, much bigger admirer of Hayek, but I think Friedman needs to be given his due. He's done some good things, and we'll see what they are. I'll start out with Friedman's monetarism, and as most of you know, it's based on the basic equation of exchange, which I think is something that's very useful, that equation. I know some of the Austrians are critical of it because it has that velocity term. Some Austrians like to even make fun of the whole concept of a velocity of money, and yet it's just a frequency of circulation. That's all it means. So the total quantity of money in existence, that is the money supply, multiplied by the number of times on average each of those dollars change hands, that's the velocity of money, must equal total expenditures. And total expenditures is also represented by the quantity of stuff you buy multiplied by the prices of those things. So MV equal PQ, it's an equation whose validity has not been challenged by anyone that I know. Keynes would say MV does equal PQ, as would even the Austrians. Mises himself endorsed the quantity theory, meaning by it a supply and demand approach to monetary theory, and a theory that was distinct from the so-called state theory of money, which is the notion that money has value because the state said so or issued it. Okay. So in V equals PQ, we don't disagree with it. Now, to turn this equation, whose truth value is not in question, into a proposition that's sort of unique to Friedman, or certainly associated with Friedman, we add some qualifications. So with a mild upward trend in velocity, and we'll make it so mild that you don't even see it, it'll be a constant velocity, at least for pedagogical purposes. And with output growing slowly, and yes, Q grows, output over time grows, but in the low single digits, okay? It doesn't double from one year to the next. And so with the V and Q changing only slowly, and in the extreme not changing much at all, then we get a very strong relationship between the price level and the money supply. The price level moves with the money supply, okay? So there's your constant V, and although we can add or can allow for a slight upward trend, as we'll do shortly, and there's a constant Q, although again we can allow for some growth, but in the low single digits, that's about all you can get in the way of sustainable growth. Then you get a strong relationship between M and P. If M goes up, P goes up, okay? The cause and effect relationship goes from M to P, and we associate that with Friedman, but that was understood, of course, early on by the Austrians, and yet at the time Friedman wrote his articles in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, that was in doubt. And even if you listen to political debate today, that's in doubt. You'll hear politicians lament that prices are rising, but pledge to make sure enough money is being created to allow you to pay those higher prices, as if it's the increase in the money supply that leads to the printing of more money to pay those prices. And Friedman was here to say early on that no, cause goes the other way. It's the increase in the money supply that causes the increase in prices, but not immediately, with a lag of 18 to 30 months. And in my view, and as we'll see later, this 18 to 30 months is sort of the Achilles heels of monetarism. Why should it take that long? It's sort of surprisingly long if you stick strictly with the monetarist formulation. Surprisingly long for new money to show up as increased prices. And we'll see later on that when Friedman is really pressed to explain how could it be that long, he resorts to arguments that will be very familiar to you, okay, because you've read them in Hayek, okay. So even Friedman thinks it's a pretty long lag, and it requires some extracurricular explanation. It's not really an integral part of the basic equation there, okay. Now, from that proposition comes the well-known Monitress Rule, right? And what you can see here is that the rule hinges very critically on the notion that the velocity of money either doesn't change or doesn't change very much. Friedman says it's stable. He doesn't really mean it's constant. He means it's a stable function of a few variables that we have a pretty good handle on. And as we'll see in a subsequent chart, velocity trends upward. And Friedman has documented that and showed the empirical demonstration of that from country to country. But as long as it's trending upward at a smooth rate, okay, we can handle it. We know what it's going to do next. So Friedman's rule is that that the Fed should increase the money supply at a slow and steady rate so as to achieve long-run price level constancy. Okay, so his idea of monetary stability is gauged by how stable or constant, in this case, the level of prices is. And you can see from the equation that it would work that way. If Q is going up just a little, a couple 3%, and velocity is rising at something less than that, then money supply should increase so that the price level itself doesn't change. Okay, that's the monetary rule. And to his credit, Friedman made the strong case for rules versus discretion. We could quibble about the particular rule even in the context of monetarism, but what was more important to Friedman here, I think, is that you tie the central bank's hand and tie them down to a rule. It's a monetary rule. Okay, of course they've never done it. In fact, if they did, they would no longer be seen as having the power that they have. Ordinarily, Greenspan is seen as the second most powerful individual in the government. Okay, second only to the president, and that's been true except during the Clinton administration when Greenspan was considered the third most powerful, and Clinton was second. Okay. Okay, so what I want you to see here is the critical nature of velocity being constant, okay, or velocity being stable in the sense that Friedman suggested. In fact, if you've reviewed the Monitress writings from the 50s and through the 60s and into the 70s, most of the graduate students at Chicago who wrote under Friedman did studies on the demand for money. And the demand for money is proxied by the velocity of money. They're related to one another inversely. In other words, if velocity is high and you're treating money like a hot potato, spending it as soon as you get it, you don't have much of a demand to hold money. You spend it as soon as you get it. Okay? Where if velocity is low, it means that you get money and hold it for some time before you spend it. Then the demand to hold money is relatively strong. Okay, so there's an inverse relationship between velocity on the one hand and the demand for money on the other. And the monitors refer to those two terms almost interchangeably. So if you're studying the velocity of money, studying the stability of the velocity of money, or studying the stability of the demand for money, it's the same thing, just two ways of looking at the same thing. And I remember years ago when I was a student at the University of Virginia, I was invited to the University of Chicago to give a talk, and met several of the graduate students there, and at a little luncheon they sort of went around the table and asked each of them to explain what they were working on. All right? And the first one, who sounded very enthusiastic, he says, well, I'm looking at money supply in Venezuela, and I'm studying the period 1920 to 1930, and showing that the demand for money didn't change during that period. Okay. You go into the next one, and he had a similar story. It's a different country in a different time period, and by the time you get to the third or fourth one, they just say, France, 1940 to 1960, whatever it was, another country, another time. They all have picked their country, picked their time period, and show that the velocity of money didn't change much during that period. Those were the dissertations. And it seems like a trivial kind of a conclusion, but it's not, because what it suggests is that if there aren't any disturbances coming from the demand side of the money market, then whatever monetary disturbances there are must be coming from, guess where, the supply side of that market. And what is the supply side of that market? It's the Federal Reserve. All right? So it was a way of demonstrating that the disturbances that Keynes had associated with the market itself, markets are inherently unstable, they tend to collapse and so on, that those disturbances don't need to be denied, but they need to be attributed not to the supply, or not to the demand side of the money market or to the animal spirits that move the investment market, but rather to the supply side of the money market, namely the Federal Reserve. So those were empirical results showing that it was the Fed that was responsible for the disturbances, and further showing that the Fed could quit being the source of disturbances if only it would follow the monetary rule. Okay, increase the money supply at a slow and steady rate, and maintain price level stability. So the arguments hinted critically on that empirical observation. Now, monitors are first and foremost empiricists. In fact, they don't really have much of an analytical framework unless that equation itself is their framework. Okay? So they're empirically oriented, and it hinges critically on that velocity of money remaining stable. Well, let's see what's happened to the velocity of money, both during the heyday of monetarism and since, and see what we can make of it. I think I've got that on the next. This is from Bradford DeLong. He's not an Austrian, but he writes on the triumph of monetarism, and tellingly a question mark. And he plots the velocity of money, okay? So there's the velocity of money. And notice that the heyday of monetarism is back in the 50s and into the 60s and 70s up until about, guess when? About 82 or whatever. And during that period, the vertical axis is exaggerated, so the trend looks a little more dramatic than it actually is, or if you plot it a little bit differently. But what you can see is that the velocity is very well behaved. The black line or dark line follows the purple line rather closely. And so you don't have any trouble predicting what velocity is going to be. And the monetary rule would be easy to implement. But then, starting in about 1982, velocity went silly. And if I extended this on out, it only goes to 2000. But if I brought it on out, you'd just see more gyrations. Okay. I wanted to stick with DeLong's rather than do my own, because this is from the mainstream literature to show that the velocity of money went silly, which means that there's no scope for applying the monetary rule, even in the monetarist's own judgment, once you get beyond 82. Now, it's interesting, of course, to go back and ask, well, okay, so what happened in 82? You know, why did velocity go silly? And if you remember that period, that's when we had a lot of banking deregulation. And importantly, we had the phasing out of a critical regulation that was imposed by the Federal Reserve called Regulation Q. And Q had no special significance. It was just that far down the alphabet in their list of regulations. Right? But essentially, Regulation Q was a regulation that gave us a very sharp distinction between what's money and what's an earning asset, what's money and what's saving. And according to Regulation Q, it wasn't legal to pay interest on checking account money. And it wasn't legal to offer checking on saving deposit money. Okay? So if you deposit your money in a bank or any other financial institution for that matter, you couldn't make a deposit on which you could A, get interest, and B, write a check. That was not allowed. Regulation Q said so. And the only institutions that could allow you to write a check were banks. Okay, not credit unions or savings and loan accounts or money market mutual funds or all the rest. None of those things could allow the writing of checks before the early 1980s. Okay? So with Regulation Q being phased out, all of a sudden it blurred the distinction between what's money and what's not. When Regulation Q was enforced, we had a strict, crisp definition of the money supply. It was called M1. Okay? And anything beyond that, you couldn't write a check on it, so you couldn't use it for transactions balances. And M1 itself, you couldn't draw interest on. So make up your mind. Do you want to draw interest or do you want to write a check? You can do both. Right? After 82, you could do both. Right? So people can deposit money in a money market mutual fund and write a check. It has to be a check of $500 or more or whatever it is. Or you can put it in the credit union and write a check. Or you can put it in your savings account and write a check. Or you can have your bank automatically transfer funds out of your saving into your checking as you write checks to draw that out, which is equivalent to writing checks on your saving account. Okay? And therefore, see, this is the velocity of M1. Well, fine. The reason it goes silly is because M1 has no particular significance anymore after you get past 82. We could also plot the velocity of M2 or M3. At the time, there were M's numbered up to about 13, M13 or whatever it was. And they would all look fairly stable until you get to 82, and then after that, they all go silly because money is shifting around between them. Okay? As people make choices at the margin about writing checks and earning interest. All right? So there's no scope at all for instituting that monetary rule, which is why, beginning at about that time, the Fed abandoned its money growth rules and adopted interest rate targeting, which is done ever since. You hardly ever hear the Fed talk about money growth rates. It's always about changing the interest rate, targeting a different federal funds rate, all right? Because they don't know what money supply to target. This comes out in some of the testimony before the Joint Economic Committee. Let's see, I've got some script here. Velocity of money became unstable after 80. We got that. Friedman's policy rule lost its velocity anchor, and that's when the Fed abandoned money supply targeting in favor of interest rate targeting. Okay? So this gives rise to what I've called the irony of monetarism. It's funny, I hear nobody else mention this as being ironic, but I certainly think it is. And that is that Friedman, of course, generally is very much against regulations. Isn't that right? He's always in favor of deregulating. He's pretty good in that respect. Okay, deregulate. Doesn't want regulate. Doesn't need any regulation except one. Okay, he needs that regulation to give him a sharp, crisp definition of the money supply, so that the monetary rule can be instituted. And without it, you can't institute the monetary rule. So I think we'll probably say that here. The monetary rule that allows the economy to perform at its laissez-faire best presupposes a critical piece of intervention, Regulation Q, that makes the money supply operationally definable. And now it's simply not operationally definable. What's the money supply? This comes out in testimony when Greenspan meets with the Joint Economic Committee. In fact, I have a quote from Greenspan that I'm sure you'll want to write down. Greenspan says in almost a forlorn tone of voice, "We don't know what money is anymore." Okay? And that quote actually made it onto the Jay Leno show, where Leno was saying, Leno said, "I don't know that much about the Fed or monetary theory, but we should have a chairman that does know what money is." Okay, and we've got one that doesn't. He says so. He doesn't know what money is. But what he means, of course, is exactly what I just said. What do you use? M1, M2. The Fed has something called, or the St. Louis Fed has something called MZM, or you could look at bank reserves instead, or look at some broad Divisia index, which is a measure of liquidity. But nobody knows what to look at, and they don't know which, if any, is amenable to the application of the monetary rule. I think the answer is none of them are. But it explains why the Fed just threw up their hands about money growth targeting and went back to interest rate targeting in the early 1980s, which of course is very dangerous. It plays into the Austrians' hands because what do you mean targeting the interest rate? Are they going to make the interest rate be the natural rate? They don't need to do that. Just hands off and it'll be the natural rate. Okay, and so if you're going to target it at some other rate, what are you going to do? Set it below the natural rate? That's going to cause some problems. That's of course the whole Austrian theory of the business cycle. Okay, let's go on here. Now we note that, look at this MV equal PQ business. And we note that I write that Q equals QC plus QI, which means it's the output of both consumer goods and investment goods. All right? So here is an instance where Friedman is much more like Keynes than Hayek. Friedman doesn't allow for any trade-off between consumption and investment either. Keynes didn't. Friedman doesn't either. His framework won't accommodate it because he's working at a level of aggregation, namely Q, output. Output of what? Of everything. Okay? Real GDP, whether it's investment goods or consumption goods. So he lumps those two together and so can't possibly see any relative movements that might go on between them. And in fact, if you press a monetarist to answer this question, you say, yeah, Q goes up during a monetary expansion, that's bubbling up beyond the PPF. But what happens to the relative magnitudes of QC and QI? And what happens there? If you press a monetarist on that question, they'll send you to the microeconomic professor. Okay? Oh, that's microeconomics. Okay? We're macroeconomists. We work with the big picture. That's Q, all of it. Okay? We don't worry about part of it. Okay? It's not our bailiwick. And it's interesting here how you can see a relationship between Hayek, Keynes, and the monetarist. And it goes like this. Keynes did see a relationship. I mean, he separated this Q from that Q. The reason he separated it because he thought this one was not stable and that one was. Okay, that consumption demand is stable, but investment demand is not, and that's why he separated it. Not because he's trying to figure out how they move opposite one another. Okay, Hayek came along. Actually, he had been along even before Keynes wrote, but Hayek was there to say, "Look, Maynard, you can't understand it unless you disaggregate the investment sector and show multiple stages of production and how they move relative to one another based on interest rate changes." That's the Austrian theory, isn't it? Okay? And as long as you don't disaggregate, you're going to see problems there, but you're not going to see the solution. To get the solution, you have to disaggregate Q sub I. All right? Now, when Friedman came along, he moved in the opposite direction. Keynes was at too high a level of aggregation to see the solution, but he did see the problem. Friedman just raised the level of aggregation. You couldn't see the problem either. Okay? So the problem's gone, the solution's gone, it's all gone. And you got MV equal PQ. Hayek is working at a level of aggregation that allows him to see both the problem and the solution. Okay? That's sort of to me, a good criteria for good macroeconomics. If there are problems out there, like business cycles, you want to work at a level of aggregation that allows you to see those problems and to see what sort of market solutions there might be to those problems. Okay? So he's just lumped those two together. And so the interest rate changes on relative movements of consumption and investment and the pattern of investment is just no part of his theory. It's just gone. It's not there. Okay? One of the reasons it's not there is because he knew that involved a lot of capital theory, and he was at Chicago. That's where Frank Knight was. And Frank Knight was blasting away at Hayek on his capital theory. So Frank Knight had all the Chicago economists believing that they could ignore Austrian capital theory without any bad consequence. Maybe I've got time to tell that the actually clinching argument that occurred to me, I think it's clinching. I'll let you see if you think it's clinching too. I've always wondered, well, why doesn't Friedman pay enough attention to capital theory to see that it actually is relevant to the dynamics of his own monetarism? What possibly could explain it? I know about Knight, but was Knight really that influential? Okay, and I know I've met Friedman just a few times, and Friedman claims, if not in print, at least in person, that he finds the Austrian theory of capital just incomprehensible. Okay, he was talking once about Dennis Robertson's book, Banking Level or Banking Policy and the Price Level. And he offered it up as one of the most impenetrable books. You can't read that book. Dennis Robertson is hard to read. And he was telling a group of us that, and he saw me standing there. And as soon as he saw me, he pointed his finger at me, and he said, "I'll tell you another book that's absolutely incomprehensible. It's Hayek's Prices and Production." He says, "I challenge you to read that book and tell me what's in it." Okay, that was Friedman's view. Now, why hadn't he spent a little more time? I mean, Friedman is a bright person. Why hadn't he spent a little more time trying to figure out what's in that book and how it's relevant? Well, here's the key, and I got this from Friedman and Friedman's Two Lucky People, autobiography of Friedman. Rose Friedman was also an economics student, Ph.D. student at the University of Chicago. And she was working on a dissertation. And her dissertation was on, can you guess, capital theory. She never finished it, but she worked years and years after Friedman had finished his and gone on to do his empirical work. But she'd worked years and years on capital theory, and she was writing under the direction of, can you guess, Frank Knight at Chicago. Okay. Now, I know a number of couples who are both economists. It's kind of sad. Okay? Two economists marrying one another. I would never do it. Okay? My wife teaches music here at Auburn. She plays the flute. Okay, and I don't try to tell her how to play the flute. She doesn't predict interest rates, you know. We get along just fine. Okay. But I do know people who are two economists married to one another, and some of them get along. Some of them get along quite well. Okay. But the key, you know what the key is to getting along quite well? Stay away from the subject area, from the major field of your spouse. Okay? Just say no. Just stay away from it. Okay? And if they both do that, they got a chance of staying married. If they get into one another's field, you know, it's not going to work. Okay? Now, see, Austrians are empiricists too. Milton and Rose are still married. Okay? They're still together after all these years. However did they do it? I'll tell you how they did it. Friedman stayed out of capital theory. No, that's Rose's topic, you know. Not going to get in it. To me, that's the empirical test I'm using here is one invented by Fritz Machlup, a good Austrian. Okay, he calls it the aha test. So in my estimation, anyhow, that passes the aha test. I get it. See how it works. Okay. Now look, let's give Friedman his due. He's the one that made it broadly understood that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Most often quoted passage in Friedman. It's got to be true. Mises knew it. Of course, you can find things in Theory of Money and Credit that is every bit as much to the point, although he didn't say it quite in those terms. All right. But what we're interested in now, you see, it's a long-run proposition. It's a long-run proposition. So what Friedman is saying is that when M increases here, then once all the dust has settled, the only lasting effect is an increase in P. It's in the long run, inflation is always and everywhere. Yes, Milton, that's true. We agree. We'll buy into that. But let's go back and talk about this dust. What does it look like? What's the nature of the dust? What's going on in the meantime before this long 18 to 30 month period until all you get is the inflation, all right? And in fact, if you answer that from a Hayekian standpoint, you get a boom and a bust. Okay, that is the boom and the bust before the economy is back on a growth path that can be sustainable, and all you have left is a lingering inflation. So what goes on in the short run during that critical 18 to 30 month period? And by the way, why is that lag so long? Why is it 18 to 30 months? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next. And I want to do it in terms that will be familiar to you if you've taken principles level or certainly intermediate level macroeconomics. But I think I can lay it out. And one of my favorite monitors, Canadian monitors, David Laidler, has been a little bit critical of Friedman here, and he says, well, Friedman's theory about the short run is not really monetary theory at all. It's a theory of labor market dynamics. And maybe that theory is right and maybe it's wrong, but it's not really monetary theory. It's a theory of how labor markets work. And I've got it laid out down here, but let's go through it and I'll show you what happens. This eventually gives rise to a Phillips curve, short run, long run Phillips curve analysis. And according to this view of Monitress, rising prices create a discrepancy between the real wage rate as perceived by the employer and the real wage rate as perceived by the employee. Now, let me explain. It's not that one is a little better at perceiving than the other. It's that they're trying to perceive different things, okay? So look at it from the point of view of the employer first, okay? You're the guy hiring the workers, and you're producing output just one output. It's a widget, whatever it is. You're producing widgets. And you're paying a wage rate. Then, because of monetary injections into the economy, you get some rising prices. You see the prices rising. You see that you can get more for your widgets. You see the widget prices rising generally, yours too. And yet nothing has happened in the labor market yet. Okay? Well, what you see, and see very dramatically, see very immediately, is that the real wage rate has fallen. That is, the wage you're paying relative to the price of the output you're selling. You're getting a good deal for labor, and you'd like to hire some more of it. Okay? So you see these workers as being willing to accept less wages now, less in terms of what you're selling. Okay? And so you believe you'll hire some more of them. You see the wage rate going down relative to this price. And you're just moving downward along your supply curve, and if the workers are willing to work, well, there must have been an increase in the supply of labor. Okay? So as far as the employer is concerned, he's simply hiring more labor, moving along his demand curve for labor, because labor is cheaper relative to the thing he's producing. The employee, though, is in a different position. He's working, he's earning a wage rate, and he's buying lots and lots of other products. Some are going up in price, some going down in price, and he can't quite see, or very quickly he can't see, what the average of the prices are. Neither can the employer, but he's just looking at one price, namely that price of the widget. Okay? So it may well be that when the employer hires more workers, he may bid the nominal wage rate up, but he hasn't bid it up as much as the increase in the price of widgets. It's still a good deal. But for the employee, if the wage rate's going up, he thinks he's getting more money because he hasn't seen yet, this is Friedman's theory, he hasn't seen yet that prices in general are rising. Okay? So the employee sees himself as moving up his supply curve because there seems to be an increase in the demand for labor. So that's why I show it here as sort of a double disequilibrium. The employer is getting labor more cheaply relative to what he's producing. The employee is getting more wages and doesn't yet see that it's not buying as much real output. Okay? So one thinks he got a wage increase, the other thinks he got a wage decrease. That graph is right out of Friedman's text, by the way. So let's go on. The employer sees the wage rate falling with respect to output prices. The employee sees, but only belatedly, the falling real wage. Initially, the employee sees a rising wage rate, and I equivocated there because it's a nominal wage rate, but he thinks it's a real wage rate because he hasn't seen inflation yet. He hasn't seen the average of prices go up. Okay, so if you look at it in the diagram, you see a real wage, that's the employer's view, and the real wage, that's the employee's view. The employee's view turns out to be mistaken, but this really gives rise to a whole collection of theories called monetary misperception theory of the business cycle, where workers misperceive the wage rate, thinking they're getting more when really they're getting less. Okay? So that's the labor market dynamics. So the way I've set it up, I've stressed that that's labor market dynamics. That's not really monetary theory per se, but that's the basis for Friedman's explanation of the short run. Now we can see what it looks like in terms of the standard short run, long run Phillips curve. And for those of you who aren't immersed in the Phillips curve theory, A.W. Phillips showed that on an empirical basis, over the years, there's an inverse relationship between inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal axis. Okay? So you can have high unemployment and low inflation, low unemployment and high inflation. That's just an empirical observation made by Phillips. Many of the Keynesians took that to be a menu of social choice. You know, what do you want? Let's choose which evil we want the lesser of and then locate ourselves on the Phillips curve accordingly. Well, Friedman was there to say that's a false trade-off because it's going to come back in your face. If you try to move up a short-run Phillips curve, it's going to shift on you and you'll end up with the same amount of unemployment as before. So thinking in terms of the dynamics, the economy might have started here with maybe a little bit of inflation going on and what do you call the natural rate of unemployment, 4, 5, 6%, whatever it is. And then with the increase in the money supply, you get this differential perception of what's going on with the real wage, and the result, in fact, one thing I should point out from that last slide, if you go back here for a minute, whichever misperception you take, the quantity effect is the same. In other words, it's an increase in quantity of labor supplied and demanded. Just a question of what's happened to the wage rate. And so more people are working and they're producing more output and earning more income. Okay, that's the boom. Okay, and so the market moves up the short-run Phillips curve in that direction. But eventually, and again, we have to wonder, why would it take 18 to 30 months for people to figure out that their income is not buying the goods it used to buy? Are they really that dim-witted that it takes them that long to figure it out? That you have to have some other explanation of why the lag is so long. But once they figure it out, then you lose that differential perception that both employer and employee see what the real wage is, and you revert back to the original supply and demand for labor, which is to say you revert back to the natural rate of unemployment, although you've got inflation because the money supply is growing. Okay, so that's Friedman's long-run, short-run analysis, and it explains. It's an explanation. You might not say not a very good one, but it's an explanation of boom and bust. How the monetary authority can initiate a boom that eventually gives you a bust. But it's sort of an odd theory for a lot of reasons. And I think maybe my next slide will make that case. Well, let's look here. In response to an increase in the money supply, the economy moves up a short-run Phillips curve, where the curve itself shifts as workers straighten out their perceptions of the real wage. The long-run Phillips curve is vertical. That's Friedman's contribution. You got a vertical long-run real wage. It just shows up as inflation. Okay. Now, I put my own capital-based macro up here just to show you how peculiar Friedman's explanation is, because it hinges exclusively on labor market dynamics and independent of whether those labor markets are early stage or late stage. That doesn't matter. And isn't it odd that even though new money comes into the market through credit markets and therefore would have its first effect on interest rates, nonetheless shows up in Friedman's theory as a misperception of changes in the wage rate? Okay, isn't that odd? But that's the way he treats it, and he treats both those labor markets the same. Early stage, late stage, it doesn't matter. You get the misperception, you get more people working, you get the Hayekian triangle increasing in size but not in shape. That has more of a Keynesian flavor than an Austrian flavor. You push out beyond the production possibilities frontier, but with no investment bias because the interest rate doesn't come into the theory at all. And once the perceptions are straightened out, then the economy reverts back to where it was. So it's just straight out and straight back as the labor markets sort themselves out. And this is why Friedman, it's such an antiseptic kind of a dynamic. It goes out and then back, and you're fine, okay? No real problems in the meantime. And that's what causes Friedman to neglect that whole aspect of his theory, arguing that, oh, well, that's just a first round effect. That's just a transitional effect. Don't get hung up on that, okay? Yeah, it might push it out, but it'll come back, okay, as these perceptions get straightened out. So to the extent that he acknowledges this boom-bust business, it's pretty trivial. It doesn't really affect much. It has very little claim on our attention because the interest rate, doesn't do any changing at all. Okay, but note here, and now I'm going to give you some conflicts within the monetary theory. A rise in P, as prices, is prerequisite to a money-induced boom. That is, P must rise and then be differentially perceived, causing Q to rise. Okay? So the logic of the story is that prices go up. Well, that means that people somehow already have the new money in their hands and are spending it, driving up prices, and then the differential perception of those prices is what causes output to rise. Okay, so P goes up first, dragging Q up with it. Is that really the way things work? If P doesn't rise, then there's no boom, because there can't be. There's no misperception, no differential perception. Now, what this shows is the applicability of the two theories, Hayek and Friedman. Because one thing we noticed in the 1920s is that the price level didn't rise. And it didn't rise because there was some underlying real output growth. And just enough to offset the increase in the money supply. So it was as if the Fed was following a monetary rule. Money was going up, output was going up, prices weren't changing. Friedman thinks that's the heyday, the glory years, the golden years of the Federal Reserve, because the price level wasn't changing. He thinks they were doing everything just right during the 20s. Okay? And he takes the constant price level to indicate that. And he can't tell a story of boom and bust during the 20s because there's no boom. How can there be a boom? You can't have differential perceptions of changes in the price level if the price level is not changing. Okay? So the monetarist theory just doesn't apply to the episode of the 1920s. Of course, the Austrian theory does, because even though the price level is not changing, nonetheless, the money is coming in through credit markets, and it's lowering interest rates, and it's changing the allocation of resources among the stages of production. You get the whole Austrian story during the 20s that is an artificial boom, and is allowed to persist for almost 10 years, mainly partly because people thought everything was just fine because the price level is not changing. All right? So you have to have that price level change to get the story. So the Mises-Hayek theory applies to these two episodes. The other one I mentioned is 1990s, when the price level changed very little. But Friedman's theory doesn't apply, or only applies very mildly in that 1990s case. Okay? So according to short-run, long-run theory, look at this. Q rises to the extent that P rises. You've got that, because you have to have P rising first, then the differential perception dragging up Q. Okay? But M equal PQ suggests that Q rises to the extent that P does not rise. Isn't that right? Because look here. M goes up, and P and Q need to go up by some combination. You'd think that either one or the other, but not both, could go up. How could one go up and pull the other one up? Okay. Remember, there's an 18 to 30 month lag between the increase in M, I should say, and the increase in P. That should be a P right there. In other words, Friedman himself, in describing the lags, says it takes 18 or 30 months before you see nothing but inflation. Okay? And in that period, you have output rising. So you might think the output rises before prices do, in which case you can't stick with the long-run, short-run Phillips Curve story. Also, one of the fundamental propositions of monetarism, one that Friedman himself lists, includes in his short list, is that when M is increased, Q rises first, but P rises hardly at all. Okay? So you have a contradiction within the monetarist view. Which rises first? Is it P? P rises and drags Q up? Or does Q rise first, according to the one of the fundamental propositions? That's a contradiction that Friedman himself has never addressed, as far as I know, nor I've communicated, corresponded with David Lathler on this issue. He doesn't know of any instance either where Friedman has addressed this issue. And yet we can address it. According to orthodox monetarism, that means textbook monetarism, essentially. Look, Q rises first. Q rises as a result of P rising. And Q is unaffected in the long run. Those are the things we have to rationalize. But I think we can. I think we can. The three claims together suggest a self-reversing process with a flourish. The flourish is long-run, short-run Phillips Curve theory. So it goes like this. In the face of an increased money supply, Q rises, as does P. But Q then falls to its initial level as P becomes fully adjusted to the higher money supply. Okay? In other words, it's a self-reversing process. In other words, a boom-bust process. Look up here. Here's the way it goes. You start out with a money supply and a price level. Okay? And when you get monetary injection, that puts upward pressure on Q. I mean, people spend the money and they hire labor and they get output. Q goes up. Okay? Eventually, prices start rising. And when prices finally rise to their full level, Q will have fallen back down. So you get the cyclical movement of Q, while P is taking a while to get up to its new level given the new money supply. And I said all that without mentioning the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is just a little flourish. In other words, Q rises and then P rises later. Now it's possible that when P rises, you can get this differential misperception that gives a little boost to Q. But still, the thing plays itself out with Q falling back down to its original level and P rising to the full extent of the increase in M. So during the process, labor market dynamics can give an extra boost to Q. That's all there is to that Phillips curve story, and it has no empirical basis, but it's conceivable, I guess. Okay. Here's a model that I'm not going to explain to you except to point out an interesting feature. It's a model by Don Patinkin in which he deals, unlike most monetarists, with the natural rate of interest. Okay? But in order to simplify his theory, he assumes that output and the employment of labor does not change throughout the adjustment process. Well, that rules out everything we've said so far, doesn't it? Because Q rises and then falls. The whole long-run, short-run Phillips curve has Q rising. But for simplicity, Patinkin says, well, assume Q doesn't change. And the economy starts out with a certain price level. I'm calling it a half P here. Starts out here. It's an old equilibrium. The economy starts out here. It has a certain rate of interest. And then the Fed increases the money supply. So people have got more money to spend. And they want to spend it on goods. And they do spend it on goods, but there are no more goods than before. So they get frustrated. They can't buy more goods collectively because there aren't more goods. Okay? Because he's holding output constant. Doesn't change. No more workers, no more output than before. So they get frustrated. They can't spend it on goods so well. What do they spend it on? They spend it on assets, earning assets, stocks and bonds and so on. Patinkin focuses on bonds. So they start buying bonds instead because they got more money. They don't want to hold the money. They can't find more goods, so they buy bonds. Well, if they buy bonds, they increase the price of bonds, which means they lower the interest rate. Okay? So what Patinkin says is that the economy moves from this price level to that price level. It doubles after a doubling of the money supply, but it does it in a path that involves a lowering of the interest rate. See, so the first time you got a monetarist view of how the interest rate gets lowered during the adjustment process. It's not lowered simply because money came in through credit markets and depressed interest rates. It's lowered because people trying to spend new money can't buy any more goods because there aren't any more goods, and so they buy bonds instead, driving bond prices up and interest rate down. Okay? Now the reason I bring this in, this just tells you about that. We won't read it. Running short of time. Okay? Q remains at its full employment level during the adjustments of the price level and the interest rate. Okay? The interest rate falls and then rises as the price level becomes fully adjusted to the higher money supply. Note that the interest rate is low for a period of 18 to 30 months without there being any effect on the makeup of output, because Patinkin, like Friedman, doesn't deal with the makeup of output. Okay? And here I'm emphasizing the contrast between those two constructions, because one of them, short-run, long-run Phillips curve analysis, holds the interest rate constant, or at least just puts it out of play, and deals with changes in output, where Patinkin holds output level constant and deals with changes in the interest rate. Okay? And what I claim is all you have to do is put them together. Look, take two views of monetarism, and you see that output levels are higher at the same time that the interest rate is lower. Well, isn't the allocation of that output within the stages of production also affected? Surely it is, and that's what Hayek's theory is all about, okay? But it gets overlooked by Friedman, okay? So here I'm saying that, suppose each is half right. The rate of interest falls and then rises, the economy adjusts to an increase in the money supply. While at the same time, the level of employment rises and then falls, okay? Would the increase in labor input be allocated intertemporally in accordance with the relatively low rate of interest? Well, surely it would, and that is Hayek's theory, okay? Now, I can get through this very quickly, I think. Here, to me, here's another telling part of monetarism. Friedman, when pressed to explain why should it take as long as 18 to 30 months to get this total adjustment, he resorts to what really is an Austrian argument. Let's read what he says. And this is from an article called The Lag Effect. So he said, okay, let's put all this other theory aside and figure out why that lag is so long. Okay? And let's just read it. He says, holders of cash will bid up the price of assets. That's of course, Patinkin argument, too. If the extra demand is initially directed at a particular class of assets, say government securities or commercial paper, or the like, the result will be to push prices of such assets out of line with other assets, and thus to widen the area into which the extra cash spills. The increased demand will spread sooner or later, affecting equities, houses, durable producers' goods, durable consumers' goods, early stage production. Oh, he didn't say that. And so on. And so on. That's early stage production. Though not necessarily in that order. These effects can be described as operating on interest rates with scare quotes. He says, if a more cosmopolitan interpretation, that's my Austrian in there. Austrians are cosmopolitan. Okay. Is adopted than the usual one, which refers to a small range of marketable securities. He said when he says interest rate, he means a small range of market securities. He said if you want to look at the broad picture on interest rates, then isn't that the Austrian story? Let's go on. The key feature of this process during which interest rates are low is that it tends to raise the prices of sources of both producers and consumer services relative to the prices of the services themselves. He's saying that in Knightian terms. But the sources mean early stages. The services are final output. It therefore encourages the production of such sources, early stages, and at the same time, the direct acquisition of the services rather than the sources. That's the overconsumption. You got overconsumption and malinvestment. But these reactions, in their turn, tend to raise the prices of the services relative to the prices of the sources. That's the counter movements described by Mises. That is to undo the initial effects of the interest rate. The final result may be a rise in expenditures in all directions without any change in the interest rate at all. Interest rates and asset prices may simply be a conduit through which the effect of the monetary change is transmitted to expenditures without being affected at all. So he's really going through the whole Austrian business cycle theory. And look, he concludes this way. He says, it may be that a monetary expansion induces someone within 2 or 3 months to contemplate building a factory, within 4 or 5 to draw up plans, within 6 or 7 to get construction started. The actual construction may take another 6 months, and much of the effect on income stream may come still later insofar as the initial goods used in construction are withdrawn from inventories and only subsequently lead to an increase in expenditures by suppliers. That's the Austrian theory. Isn't that the Austrian theory? And yet, see, he's willing to articulate this and say, that explains why the lag is so long. But once we understand why the lag is so long, then put that theory out of the way and go back to the long-run, short-run Phillips curve. It doesn't make any sense. Okay? And there I present this again. I'm going to leave you with, I can't go across that point. That's running out of time. Let me just end it there. Thank you much.